Something just shifted across the United States, and before you make a single plan for the weekend or the week ahead, I need you to sit with me for the next 20 minutes and hear this properly. Because the story a lot of people are telling right now, the story that says the worst of the summer is behind us, is simply not what the data is showing. What the data is actually showing is a country still trapped under one of the most stubborn heat domes of the entire year, a wall of severe storms rolling through the east right now, and a pattern that refuses to let go even as we push deeper into the back half of August. This is not a small update. This is one of those weeks where the atmosphere is genuinely trying to tell us something, and if you ignore it, you could end up caught off guard. So stay with me, because over the next several minutes, I'm going to walk you through every single piece of this, the storms tonight, the heat that is breaking records as we speak, and the pattern shift that decides whether any real relief is coming at all. No sugarcoating, no comforting version, just the honest read of what the atmosphere is actually doing. Let me start with what is happening on the ground right now, because before we talk about next week, we have to deal with tonight. As of this evening, scattered strong to severe thunderstorms are rolling from the coastal Carolinas up into the mid-Atlantic states, and forecasters are not ruling out an isolated tornado or two embedded in that line. This is not a minor disturbance. The National Weather Service's own short-range discussion out of College Park describes multiple rounds of showers and thunderstorms working across the Central Plains and the East through Saturday, with a real risk of excessive rainfall and flash flooding, especially from Virginia into the Carolinas. A broad upper-level ridge is parked stubbornly over the southern United States, and every shortwave disturbance and every surface boundary that tries to slide through the central and eastern part of the country is running straight into that warm, unstable air mass sitting underneath it. That collision is exactly what is firing up these rounds of storms night after night. Here is how tonight plays out. The main threat is once again damaging straight-line wind, the kind of gusts that snap tree limbs, rip down power lines, and knock out electricity in neighborhoods that have already been dealing with outages from earlier rounds this week. Embedded within that broader line, there's enough instability and enough shear working in from the coast that a spin-up tornado becomes a real, if narrow, possibility, particularly close to the coastal Carolinas and up into parts of the mid-Atlantic overnight. If you're anywhere along that corridor tonight, keep away to receive alerts nearby before you go to sleep, because these overnight storms are the ones that catch people off guard, simply because most of us are not checking the radar at 2 in the morning. Behind tonight's line, the pattern does not calm down, it just relocates. Severe weather chances shift back toward the Central Plains on Friday, with the threat for damaging wind and a flash flood risk following the same boundary that has been draped across the southern plains through the southeast and up into the mid-Atlantic for days now. This boundary is not going anywhere fast. It is essentially acting like a seam between two very different air masses, brutally hot and dry to its south, unstable and moisture-rich to its north, and every time a disturbance rides along that seam, you get another round of storms. That is the mechanical reason this week has felt like one wave of storms after another, instead of a single clean system passing through and clearing out. I want to slow down on this part for a second, because it explains something a lot of you have probably noticed without quite putting your finger on it. Normally, a frontal boundary is a temporary visitor. It swings through, it clears the humidity out behind it, and within a day or two, the atmosphere resets. And what is happening instead this week is that the boundary is essentially stuck in place, draped across the same general corridor day after day, because there is nothing strong enough in the pattern above it to actually push it through and out to sea. Every disturbance that rides along it acts almost like a wave rolling down a wire that is anchored at both ends, producing another burst of storms without ever actually clearing the wire away. That is why the severe threat keeps reappearing in roughly the same stretch of the country instead of moving on the way a textbook system would. And it is also why the flash flood risk deserves just as much attention as the wind and tornado threat, because when repeated rounds of heavy rain fall over the same saturated ground night after night, rivers and creeks that handled the first round just fine can be pushed well past their capacity by the third or fourth round. If you live along that corridor from the southern plains through the mid-Atlantic, the practical takeaway is simple. Do not assume that because you got through last night's storms without major damage, tonight or tomorrow night will look the same. Each new round is landing on ground that is already saturated, which means the flooding risk actually climbs as this stretch continues rather than easing off. Now let's talk about the heat, because honestly, this is the part of the forecast that matters most to the largest number of people watching right now, and it is not improving the way a lot of you are hoping. Right now, more than 70 million people across the southeast are under active heat alerts. Feels like temperatures are sitting near or above 100 degrees across huge stretches of the south, and in some spots the heat index is climbing as high as 115 degrees. Earlier this week, Miami hit 100 degrees at the airport, tying a record that had stood since 1942, over 84 years ago. Let that sink in for a second. That is not a typical August afternoon. That is a mark that has not been touched in more than 8 decades, and it happened this week. The truly dangerous part of this setup, the part I want you to actually internalize rather than just skim past, is the lack of overnight relief. In a normal heat event, the human body gets a break once the sun goes down. Temperatures drop, the air cools, and your body has a chance to recover from the stress of the daytime heat before doing it all again tomorrow. That recovery window is what keeps a hot week from turning into a genuinely dangerous one. But across huge sections of the South right now, overnight lows are barely dipping, staying stuck in the upper 70s and low 80s well after midnight. When the nights stay that warm, the danger does not reset each day, it compounds. Day 2 of a heat wave with no overnight relief is more dangerous than day 1. Day 4 is more dangerous than day 2. This is exactly the mechanism that makes prolonged heat waves so deadly, and it is precisely what is unfolding right now across Texas, Oklahoma, southern Georgia, coastal South Carolina, the Florida Panhandle, and the Mid-South region around Memphis, where combined heat and humidity have pushed the heat index above 105, and in some spots above 110 degrees. Before I move to the western half of the country, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely do read through these, so drop it in the comments if you can. If you're anywhere in that stretch from the south up through the mid-Atlantic, tell me your town and what this week has actually looked like on the ground. Whether that is standing water on your street, a tree down, a power flicker, or just a genuinely miserable, sticky night where you could not cool your house down no matter what you tried. And tell me one thing that has actually helped you get through a stretch like this, whether it is a trick for keeping a room cool without running the air conditioning nonstop, a hydration routine, or a way you check in on someone nearby who might be struggling more than you are. Some of the best, most practical advice on this channel comes directly from that comment section. And it genuinely helps other people who are living through their first real taste of a heat wave like this one. Out west, a completely different flavor of the same problem is setting up. In San Diego and across much of Southern California, high pressure, essentially a heat dome, has shifted west and is now pumping in more heat and more humidity as monsoon moisture strengthens. Temperatures are trending as much as 8 degrees above average heading into next week, with coastal areas running mid-70s to mid-80s, inland valleys pushing well into the 90s, and desert locations soaring to between 110 and 115 degrees. Layered on top of that heat is a real thunderstorm risk over the mountains and deserts each afternoon and evening. And any storm that fires in that setup can produce heavy rain, strong gusty winds, small hail, and localized flash flooding, especially given how parched and baked the ground already is after weeks of heat. That combination, extreme dry heat suddenly interrupted by an intense, fast-moving storm cell, is its own separate hazard, because flash flooding in desert terrain can happen with almost no warning. The mechanism behind that risk is worth explaining rather than just stating, because it tells you why these desert storms are so dangerous, even though they often look small on radar. Ground that has been baked under 100+ degree heat for weeks does not absorb rainfall the way normal soil does. It essentially seals over, so instead of soaking in, the water runs off the surface almost immediately, funneling into washes, canyons, and low-lying roadways that can go from bone dry to a fast-moving torrent in a matter of minutes. That is exactly why so many flash flood fatalities in the desert Southwest happen in vehicles, on roads that looked perfectly safe 5 minutes earlier. If you are anywhere near the mountains or deserts of Southern California, Arizona, or Nevada over the coming days and you see building thunderstorm clouds in the distance, that is not the moment to start a hike or push forward on a desert road. That is the moment to reroute and wait it out. This is also a good point to mention the fire weather angle, because it tends to get overshadowed by the heat headlines, even though it is directly connected to the same pattern. Fire weather concerns are expected to persist across the Four Corners region as this ridge holds firm, since the combination of prolonged heat, low relative humidity, and occasional gusty outflow, winds from these desert thunderstorms, creates close to ideal conditions for fire spread. A storm that produces very little rain but plenty of lightning and wind is often the worst possible outcome in this kind of setup, because it can ignite new fires without delivering enough moisture to slow them down. Now, here is the piece that ties all of this together and explains why this summer has felt relentless instead of just hot in patches. We are inside a strengthening El Niño pattern this year, and forecasters have been increasingly confident that this could develop into what some are calling a super El Niño as we move through the back half of the year. El Niño years tend to load the dice toward exactly this kind of pattern, a hot, humid, storm-prone summer across much of the country, with the most intense and persistent heat typically favoring the interior west and the southern plains. That is not a coincidence, and it lines up with what meteorologists were already warning about back at the start of summer when a significant, dangerous heat wave was forecast to expand from the central U.S. into the eastern U.S., with numerous daily record highs and warm overnight lows expected to fall along the way. We are now watching that forecast play out almost exactly as described, and unfortunately, it has already proven costly. This year's North American heat wave has been directly linked to dozens of deaths, a grim reminder that this is not just an inconvenience, it is a genuine ongoing public health emergency, playing out in slow motion across the country. I know El Niño gets mentioned so often in forecasts these days that it can start to feel like background noise, so let me actually break down why it matters this much. In a typical year, the jet stream and the broader steering pattern across North America shift around somewhat unpredictably from week to week, which is part of why long-range forecasting is so difficult. A strong El Niño changes that. It imposes a much more consistent, more predictable signal on the global pattern, nudging the jet stream and the associated ridges and troughs into a more repeatable position for months at a stretch. This year, that signal has consistently favored a ridge parked over the interior west and southern plains, which is precisely the setup that has produced this relentless string of heat waves since early summer. It is also the same signal that has been suppressing tropical development in the Atlantic, since the very same increase in upper-level wind shear that helps anchor that ridge in place is what tears apart young tropical systems trying to organize farther east. In other words, the quiet Atlantic hurricane season and the brutal ongoing heat across the interior United States are not two separate stories this year. They are two symptoms of the exact same underlying cause. So let's talk about what comes next, because I know a lot of you are asking the same question I get asked every single week at this point in the summer. When does this actually break? The honest answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no, and I want to walk you through the reasoning instead of just handing you a headline, because understanding the why is what actually helps you plan. Forecasters are watching a broad upper-level ridge that has been anchored over the southern United States for an extended stretch now. A ridge like this acts like a lid. It suppresses cloud cover, it compresses the atmosphere and warms it through sinking air, and it steers storm systems and cool fronts around it rather than through it. As long as that ridge holds its position, the heat underneath it simply cannot break in any meaningful way, because there is no mechanism to displace it. What we are seeing in the latest guidance is that the ridge is not just holding. In some solutions, it is actually strengthening and expanding, which is exactly why places as far north as Idaho and even toward Washington state have been flirting with triple-digit heat this week, numbers that are genuinely unusual for that part of the country in August. At the same time, there is a more active, wetter storm track working across the northeast, and that is the other half of this split personality pattern. While the interior south and west bake under that ridge, disturbances riding along the northern edge of it are dropping into the east, which is exactly what is fueling these repeated rounds of severe thunderstorms and flash flood risk from the plains through the mid-Atlantic. So if you are in the northeast wondering why your week has felt stormy and unsettled, while your friends in Texas are melting, this is why. You're living on opposite sides of the same pattern. Now, the question everyone actually wants answered, does a real cool down arrive before the end of the month? Some of the outlooks do show signals of a pattern adjustment as we move toward the very end of August and into the start of September, the kind of signal that can eventually open the door for cooler air to work farther south. But here's the part I want to be completely straight with you about, because this is exactly where people get their hopes up for the wrong reasons. A brief wobble in the pattern, a short-lived dip in one index or another, is not the same thing as a genuine, sustained break in the heat. We have seen signals like this pop up on individual model runs multiple times already this summer, only to get walked back within a day or two as the models converge back toward a hot solution. The ridge has proven remarkably resilient all season, and the safest assumption right now is that any relief that does arrive is likely to be partial and temporary, rather than the kind of clean, decisive pattern change that ends a heat wave for good. Numerous daily record highs and warm overnight lows remain likely through much of the work week ahead. I also want to address something directly, because I know from the comments that a lot of you have been asking about it. People keep circulating the idea that some single dramatic cool down is about to sweep across the entire country all at once, wiping out the heat everywhere simultaneously. That is not how this pattern realistically breaks, and I would rather tell you that plainly now than have you disappointed later. Even in the best case scenario the guidance supports, any meaningful cooling arrives regionally and gradually, starting in the northern tier and only slowly working farther south over a period of a week or more, not instantly and not everywhere at once. The ridge anchoring this heat in place has proven far too resilient this season for a clean, sudden reset. And the more realistic expectation is a slow erosion of the hottest temperatures rather than a dramatic overnight flip. If you're making plans based on this forecast, plan around that slower, patchier version of relief rather than the more dramatic one that tends to spread on social media every time a single cooler signal shows up on one model run. Let me shift now to the tropics, because even though the deep tropical Atlantic has stayed relatively quiet this season, that quiet has an explanation. And I think understanding it is genuinely more useful to you than just hearing a headline that says nothing is brewing. The same strengthening El Niño pattern that is loading the dice toward heat across the interior United States is also the primary reason the Atlantic Basin has struggled to produce sustained tropical development this year. El Niño tends to crank up wind shear across the tropical Atlantic, and wind shear is brutal for a young tropical system trying to organize. It tilts the storm over, it separates the low-level circulation from the deep thunderstorm activity that a tropical system needs to survive and strengthen, and it can shred a promising disturbance before it ever gets the chance to become a real threat. Layer on top of that the periodic surges of dry, dusty Saharan air that drift off the African coast through the summer, and you get a basin that is simply inhospitable to development most of the time, even when individual model runs occasionally show something trying to spin up near the Lesser Antilles or the Leeward Islands. When you dig into the ensemble guidance on those flare-ups, more often than not, only a small fraction of the members show any real organization, and the rest show that dry air simply overwhelming anything that tries to form. This is exactly the kind of signal that causes people to panic prematurely when they see a single alarming model run, without understanding that it represents one outlier among dozens of members that disagree. What this means practically is that if you live along the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic seaboard, the more immediate concern this week is not a classically developing tropical system. It is these front-driven clusters of storms riding along the boundary I described earlier, the ones capable of producing flash flooding and damaging straight-line winds. That has been the dominant pattern for weeks now, and there is no strong signal in the guidance suggesting that changes dramatically in the immediate future. I will say this, though, August remains one of the trickiest months of the year to forecast with total confidence, because tropical moisture, even from a disturbance that never organizes into a named storm, can dramatically change local rainfall patterns with very little lead time, especially along the Gulf Coast and across the southeast. So even in a quiet tropical season, it is worth staying attentive rather than assuming the door is completely closed. There is also a broader seasonal point worth making here, because it matters for anyone along the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic seaboard trying to plan further out than just this week. A quiet stretch in August during a strong El Niño year does not automatically mean the entire rest of hurricane season stays quiet. El Niño's influence on Atlantic wind shear tends to be strongest during the peak months of the season, which does help explain the lack of development so far, but that same shear can relax in pockets, particularly closer to the United States coastline, where local factors like in sea surface temperatures and smaller scale atmospheric setups can occasionally override the broader seasonal signal for a short window. That is exactly why forecasters keep watching the Gulf and the Western Atlantic even when the deep tropics look hostile, because a homegrown system that develops close to shore does not need the same favorable large-scale environment that a classic Cape Verde storm coming off Africa would need. So the honest takeaway is not that the coast is in the clear for the rest of the season. It is that the specific type of threat right now is different, less about a classic hurricane spinning up in the open Atlantic, and more about these front-driven, flood-producing systems closer to home. Now, let me bring this all the way down to what it actually means for you, because forecasts are only useful if they change what you do. If you are anywhere across the South right now, from Texas and Oklahoma through the Mid-South and into the Southeast, you are in the most dangerous stretch of this entire pattern. The combination of extreme daytime heat, oppressive humidity, and overnight lows that refuse to drop is exactly the recipe that public health officials worry about most, because it does not give the body a chance to recover. If you work outdoors, if you're elderly, if you have a chronic health condition, or if you simply do not have reliable access to air conditioning, this is not a week to push through and tough it out. Treat it with the same seriousness you would treat any other genuine weather hazard, because that is exactly what it is. If you are along the eastern seaboard tonight, particularly from the Carolinas up into the mid-Atlantic, keep an eye on the sky and keep away to receive warnings close by overnight, since the tornado risk, while narrow, is real, and these late-night storms are historically the ones that catch the most people by surprise. A few practical things actually make a difference here. Know which room in your home is the safest option if a warning is issued. Overnight, ideally an interior room on the lowest floor, away from windows. Keep your phone charged and your notifications on, rather than relying on outdoor sirens alone, since a siren is not designed to wake you up inside a closed house. And if you have anything outside that could become a projectile in a strong gust, patio furniture, trash cans, anything loose, it genuinely takes only a few minutes to bring it in, and that few minutes can prevent real damage. If you're out in the Southwest or Southern California, remember that the danger this week is not just the heat itself, but the whiplash between extreme dry heat and sudden intense thunderstorm activity capable of producing flash flooding in terrain that simply cannot absorb heavy rain quickly. And If you're anywhere in this country hoping for a clean, decisive break in the pattern before the calendar turns to September, the honest answer, based on everything the latest guidance is showing, is that any relief on the horizon looks partial and temporary rather than a true end to this heat wave. I want to be clear about something before I wrap this up, because I think it matters. My job here is not to tell you the version of the forecast that feels the most comfortable. It is to tell you the version that is actually true, the good parts and the difficult parts together, and let you decide what to do with that information. A forecast that only tells you what you want to hear can leave you unprepared. And being unprepared in weather like this, whether it is severe storms rolling through overnight or a heat wave that refuses to loosen its grip, is genuinely how people get hurt. So take this for exactly what it is, an honest read of a pattern that is still very much active, still evolving, and still worth paying close attention to over the coming days. I also want to say something directly to anyone watching this who feels like they have already heard one too many heat wave warnings this summer and has started to tune them out. I understand that instinct completely, because when something has been repeated all season, it can start to lose its urgency in your mind even as the actual risk stays exactly the same or gets worse. But that fatigue is precisely what makes this stretch dangerous for a lot of people, because the temptation is to treat this heat wave like all the others and skip the extra precautions you took back in June or July. The data does not support treating this one casually. Overnight lows this week are running as warm as almost anything we have seen all season. And that lack of recovery time is exactly the ingredient that turns a routine hot week into the kind that ends up in the record books, and sometimes in the news for the wrong reasons. So if you find yourself feeling a little numb to yet another heat warning, that is exactly the moment to double check on the people around you who might not have the resources to handle it as easily as you do. Here is what I would ask you to actually do with this. Drink water on a schedule rather than waiting until you feel thirsty. Because in heat like this, by the time thirst kicks in, you are already behind. Check in on elderly neighbors or anyone living alone, especially if you know they do not have reliable air conditioning, because a 2-minute knock on a door genuinely can make the difference in a stretch like this. If you have pets, remember that pavement in this kind of heat can burn their paws in seconds, and they are dealing with the same heat stress you are, often with far less ability to cool themselves down. And if you are anywhere along that severe weather corridor tonight, have a way to get warnings even while you sleep, because the storms most likely to catch people off guard are the ones that roll through after midnight. So here is the honest summary, laid out plainly. Severe thunderstorms continue tonight from the coastal Carolinas into the mid-Atlantic, with a narrow but real tornado risk embedded in that line, and the threat shifts toward the Central Plains on Friday, along the same stalled boundary that has been fueling rounds of storms for days. Dangerous heat holds firm across the south, with more than 70 million people under heat alerts. Feels like temperatures well above 100 degrees, and the truly hazardous piece being overnight lows that are not dropping enough to give anyone a real break. Out west, a heat dome is deepening across Southern California and the interior Southwest, with a real risk of sudden, intense thunderstorms capable of flash flooding layered right on top of the extreme heat. The Atlantic tropics remain relatively quiet, thanks to a strengthening El Niño pattern loading up wind shear and dry air across the basin, though August's unpredictability means that could still shift with little warning. And the pattern as a whole shows no clean, decisive break on the immediate horizon, only the possibility of a partial, temporary adjustment as we push toward the very end of the month. That is the real picture, not the comforting one, but the one that actually helps you plan the days ahead. Stay hydrated. Stay aware of the forecast for your specific area, since conditions are genuinely shifting day to day right now, and look out for the people around you who might be more vulnerable to this heat than you are. I will keep tracking every piece of this as it develops, the storms, the heat, and whatever the tropics decide to do next, and I will bring you the next honest update the moment there is something worth telling you. Until then, stay cool, stay safe, and take this pattern seriously, because right now it has earned that from all of us.